Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining today's session on handling rejection in academia. I'm Helen Jarvis Griffiths, a Research and Development Advisor at the University of Leeds. And I want to start by saying that this is a topic that really does connect all of us, no matter our discipline, our career stage, or our background. Rejection is a universal part of academic life, whether it's a paper, a grant, a job application, or feedback that doesn't quite land as we'd hoped. But it's also one of the least talked about parts of the research experience. And yet, how we experience rejection isn't actually universal at all. It can feel very different depending on who we are and the context that we work in. For example, if we're neurodivergent, managing a disability or a chronic condition, or working just within systems that are not originally designed with us in mind. And those differences really shape how we process feedback, how our nervous system responds to uncertainty, and how safe we feel about moving forwards after a rejection. So today's session is really about normalizing some of those experiences, recognizing diversity in the way that we respond, and finding ways to manage rejection with compassion towards ourselves and each other. So we'll explore what rejection looks and feels like, and more importantly, how we can sustain motivation and self-belief through it. So before we begin, I just got a few housekeeping points just to keep things running smoothly. There will be a scheduled break provided partway through, and there's lots of time for reflection. You will get a copy of the presentation materials afterwards, so you don't need to try and capture everything as we go through. Your microphones and cameras will stay off during the session to keep things flowing. However, I'd love for you to join me in the chat function throughout the session. Please, if you have any questions, type a Q at the start of your question and that'll help me pick it out. In terms of note-taking, please either have a pen and paper or a digital note-taking application open. Or additionally, there is a workbook that you can use to record your reflections if you'd like, and that should come to you in the chat. So this is completely optional. Feel free to take notes in whatever way works for you. And finally, just take some time as well to complete the feedback form at the end of the session. This helps not just me, but also one, to identify topics of interest in the future. So before we get started, I'd just like to make sure that the chat is working and that I'm not just speaking into the void. So please, could you pop your name, where you're joining from, and maybe what the weather's like where you are into the chat? That would be really great. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming through in the chat. Oh, there we go. Fab. From a very wet York, yeah, it's pretty dismal here actually. There we go. Oh, South Africa. Oh, it's nice and sunny. Please send it over here. Yeah, wet Sheffield. Oh, hi, Emily, one of my colleagues. We've got a few from there. Oh, Hong Kong, cool and cloudy. It's always good to start with a bit of a weather report, isn't it? Oh, from Caerphilly. Oh, I'm Welsh. That's made my day. Hi, Rachel. Great, fantastic. It's good to see that I'm not here alone. It's quite strange when you're presenting to someone and not seeing people's faces, so that's fantastic. Wow, yeah, a few from Hong Kong. Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So we know it's working, and great to see you all with me today. Okay, so I'd just like to start today with asking you, what words or feelings come to mind when you hear the word rejection? So you can pop a few words into the chat, just single words if you like, and please just share what feels comfortable. And it's completely okay just to reflect quietly about that. I know sometimes that word can feel a bit, ooh, but please just take that time just to, pop a few words. Anxious, makes you feel, yeah, a bit weepy. Okay, yeah, last time they were upset, then relaxed. Okay. Failure, not worthy, I'm not good enough. Yeah, absolutely. I know this can be quite a tender topic, and I just want to show you that This is a psychologically safe space. There's no judgment, no right or wrong answers, no expectations to share more than you feel that you want to. So we're just acknowledging what comes up through today's session. Thank you so much for being so open and for sharing some of these things and how it really kind of hits you. Failure, frustration, sadness is coming through. There's a lot of familiar words, and they're all completely natural reactions. Words like rejection can feel quite triggering. I think for me, it makes me feel quite tense. And my instinct really is just to want to withdraw or to run or hide. That's my initial kind of rejection. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want anybody to see what this rejection that I've just experienced. Sad, yes. There's lots of words there that really kind of ring true. So I'd just like to start with a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So first, we're going to explore some of the common and sometimes hidden sources of rejection in academia. These aren't those big formal rejections like paper or grants, but the smaller moments, things like missed opportunities, unacknowledged work, or just feeling a little bit overlooked. And second, we're going to reflect on the emotional impact of rejection and ways to try and reframe some of these experiences. And finally, we'll spend some time thinking about how you can turn those experiences into learning, creating a personal action plan to rebuild motivation, and hopefully to maintain that kind of resilience and self-compassion, particularly when things didn't go to plan. So my aim today is not only to provide you with some tools and some frameworks, but hopefully to leave you with that sense that rejection doesn't define who you are or define your path. And actually working with those failures you can really build on those to get to those next steps. So at first glance, academia portrays this image of excellence, expertise, and success. The values that we are taught to aspire to, and they're reinforced at every stage of our career. So we're expected to publish and read in journals, win competitive grants in an increasingly tough landscape. We're expected to teach, supervise, contribute to outreach, somehow demonstrate leadership, innovation, and resilience all at once. That is a big list, isn't it? And that's not the half of it. It creates this, what can be referred to as this performance culture where achievement is visible and measurable, things like ref, but then rejection and failure are often hidden. You see success stories and promotion criteria, CVs and social media. And we end up a system that seems to kind of celebrate those who appear never to fail rather than those who persist to learn through failure. So on the surface, academia can look like this kind of merit-based system. If you work hard, you do great research, then you'll succeed. But in reality, progress is shaped by so many factors that are outside of our control, things like funding priorities, peer review biases, networks, timing, and luck. I can't tell you how many established researchers have told me that they were just in the right place at the right time. So while academia looks like it's all about excellence, expertise, and success, underneath there's a very different reality, and one that's really rarely talked about. So that hidden reality is, in fact, that rejection is built into the academic process. So these numbers may come as a surprise or not so much of a surprise to you, but for top journals, acceptance rates are often below 10%. Major funders typically fund between 15 and 25% of applications. And fellowships, which can shape whole careers, sit somewhere between 10 and 20%. So how do these numbers land with you? Are they surprising? Are they what you expected? Just pop a word into the chat to say, whether you're aware of these were the figures of success. Yeah, aware, sad reality, not surprising, expected and what I've experienced. Okay, a couple not aware. Okay, so we've got a bit of a mixed bag of the personal experiences. So yeah, unfortunately, this is the landscape that we work in. A lot of papers are often rejected multiple times before I find a home. I remember, I think I went through 8 different journals before one of my papers found its final home, several revisions, changing it to fit the style of the journal, makes it either results and discussions coming together or separated, and four figures or six figures. Oh, it was just an absolute, it was a tough time, going through those multiple versions and facing those rejections each time after you put so much work into it. And unfortunately, yeah, it happens. And then grant applications can take months of work and you put a lot of energy into that and then they might never get funded. It's quite demoralizing, isn't it? A bit like the weather today. Now, jobs and fellowship applications also face that huge amount of competition. And even things like conference abstracts, promotion cases can be turned down. Just reading a few things from the chat. Yeah, publication's a hard one to swallow because we often recognise them in publishing as lower impact journals, a catch-22. Yeah, absolutely. And yet, academia's culture doesn't always reflect that reality. We treat that rejection as a sign of personal inadequacy rather than that normal part of just academic life. And this can really feed our imposter feelings, perfectionism, and fear of failure. And all of those words that you kind of expressed at the start when I said the word rejection, it's the failure, feeling, not that imposter kind of syndrome. And this is particularly relevant or particularly pertinent for early career researchers and those from underrepresented groups who might already feel that they have a lot to prove. So historically, academia has valued individual achievement and prestige over that vulnerability and learning from failure. So talking about rejection or even seeking support can feel quite uncomfortable, even though it's probably one of the most universal experiences that we can share. And because academia rewards objectivity, expertise, and excellence, many researchers have internalized the idea that rejection is something to be endured privately and not something to process or talk about openly. And that has its consequences. First, that emotional suppression. We feel that pressure just to brush it off. Oh, it's fine, doesn't matter, we'll just move on, and you just bury it. And that emotional suppression is real. And it's almost that expectation that you can't talk about it. So then people then find that they over-identify with it. Personal rejection feels really personal. Professional rejection feels really personal. It's easy to start equating that my paper was rejected with I'm not good enough rather than the paper. The paper didn't get accepted for X, Y reasons, equating that with I'm just not good enough. It's me, I'm the problem. And then we also see that isolation because rejection is rarely discussed and there are few spaces to process it or to learn from others' experiences. And finally, we have that comparative culture where we mostly see other successes and not their setbacks. And that can make rejection feel a bit unusual or even shameful, when in fact it's completely normal. We all experience it, but it's quite hard to talk about, isn't it? And these patterns really shape how many of us respond. Some throw themselves into overwork to prove themselves, which can lead to burnout, and then others withdraw to protect their confidence. And both reactions make complete sense. They're absolutely human reactions. And they also reflect a culture that undervalues vulnerability and reflection, the very qualities that we actually need the most to learn and grow and sustain ourselves in this kind of environment. So I'm just wondering whether some of these patterns feel quite familiar to you in your workspaces. Is there any of these that kind of the emotional suppression? Do you feel like you need to isolate yourself? Do you over-identify, or do you really feel that comparative culture? Okay, so we've got emotional suppression, that just desire just to push things to one side and to move away. Yes to all. Isolation, yeah, that kind of, oh, I don't want to share this with anybody. Yeah, it's real. Thank you for sharing, being so open. So there's many phases of academic rejection, and some of these you might be nodding as we go through all of these different things. It's not just the papers that are rejected or the grants that weren't funded. It's things like works getting published elsewhere. Nothing worse than being scooped. I don't know whether that's a universal word or not, but when something gets published elsewhere before you've managed to publish your work, that feeling of, oh, I failed, I haven't quite got there. Or that fellowship not being selected, or the collaboration being declined, abstract not accepted for a conference. Even things like that negative feedback from a supervisor, it really hit hard sometimes. Or the job or missed promotion opportunity, or sometimes just silence and no response to if you've submitted an application for something. It can hit quite hard, and rejection can feel quite tense. It can trigger some of those emotions. But there's also self-rejection as well. So talking ourselves out from applying to something because we're assuming that we're not good enough. Oh, I'm not going to go for that because I definitely won't get it because, you know, so and so and so and so will be going for it. All of this kind of these sort of framing yourself and rejecting yourself. And these moments really can carry that kind of emotional weight. Different things will carry different emotional weight. So you might have put, I remember my first paper, I think I put so much effort into it, and it really felt quite personal when it was rejected in that initial time. And you know, if it's how much investment you've put into something, whereas something like, you know, a non-response to an email, sometimes depending on who you've emailed, it can land in different ways depending on how much heart and how much you've really connected with what you're putting, the work that you've put in. So I'd just like you to, you know, again, think about which of these are most relevant to you, which ones are cropping up at the minute. Is it all of these sorts of things that you're struggling with in terms of rejection, or is there certain things like grants not funded or papers rejections? Silence, no response, really not useful feedback. Yeah, shows they've barely read the manuscript. Yeah, that's really frustrating, and it does hit hard. Just to feel, adds that feeling of just feeling a little bit undervalued, particularly in the effort that you might have put in. Self-rejection, grants not funded. Okay, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So far we've looked at rejection across the system, how it's built into academic life, but I also want to bring it down to a personal level. We're all humans and we all experience things in the same way. We all experience rejection in one form or another. And I thought how best to kind of talk to you about just being open about my own experiences of failure. And so this is my hidden CV of rejection. So the rejections, the near misses, the disappointments that you don't actually see on a standard CV. And I'm sure every single person has got one of these. You know, they're the moments that range for me, disappointing grades that led to me resitting exams, which then led to me having a late entry into university, to more recent experiences like funding rejections, job applications that didn't work, and even trustee role that I wasn't selected for earlier on this year. Now, if you were to look at my LinkedIn profile, you'd see the highlights, but you wouldn't see this. And yet the timeline probably tells you more about my growth and my resilience than the official one ever could. And sharing this, you know, it's about honesty, it's about being vulnerable, it's been showing that this happens to everybody. And every person you admire, every supervisor, every head of department, every VC has one of these, you know, but you just don't get to see it. So up to now, we've really looked at rejection as something that happens on paper, applications, reviews, decision, but underneath of those events are the emotional and physical responses that shape how we see ourselves and how we show up afterwards. So before we do that, I just want to explore that inner landscape together. So I'd like to give you a few minutes to map out your own hidden CV, your personal rejection or failure timeline. So you can use the template that's in the chat. Just let me know that it's opening okay for everybody. Or you can just simply have a piece of paper and draw a line and some dates along the top and 5 to 10 moments that really stand out for you. They can be big, they can be small, a paper rejection, missed opportunity, or even when you've doubted yourself and didn't apply for something. It's not about getting it perfect. This is just for you. So the aim is to really start noticing those patterns, where those moments sit, and how they might have shaped your confidence and your choices. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes silent reflection. I just want you to use this time however works best for you. If it's jotting notes, doodling, or just simply thinking about it. I'd also like to add, if at any point something feels uncomfortable, that's completely fine. This working on this kind of thing can feel a little bit uncomfortable. So make sure that you do step away or just sit with it or remember to breathe. And you don't need to share anything unless you feel that you want to or choose to. Okay, so it is. Okay, yeah, show your sample timeline. Absolutely. Let me just move back. There we go. So I've got the sample timeline. Where's the workbook? So the workbook should have just been shared by the admin team. I will share in the chat the activity. So basically what's in the workbook, if you don't have it to hand, so you can probably copy and paste this into a document. Ask anybody to share, because I think it's a personal thing as well. So hopefully you've got that timeline in front of you, and then we can work on that moving forwards in the next part. So here, next, we're going to really look at that inner landscape. So this is a model, is an adapted version of the Kubler-Ross change curve, which is originally used to describe grief. So you may or may not have come across it before, but it kind of maps surprisingly well to the emotional journey of rejection in academia. So I'd like you to think back to one or two moments from your rejection timeline, ones that have really stayed with you. What emotions do you remember most clearly? Was it shock, shame, defensiveness, frustration, or something else? And we often move through these kind of emotional stages of rejection, not in that kind of neat linear way, but often in waves, and we can move back and forth between them. And hopefully this curve can help you visualize what that emotional journey might look like, and it helps us to really notice where we tend to get stuck or where we begin to regain momentum. Now, rejection can also trigger our body's natural stress response. And you might have come across the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Some of us might go into fight mode, pushing ourselves harder to prove ourselves, whereas others may withdraw or go quiet in that flight or freeze mode. Or sometimes we might fall into the fawn mode, which might be something that's somebody not as familiar with, but that's the trying to please, fix, or appease others to feel safe again. And we'll come back to exploring some of these 4Fs a bit later on when we explore how we respond and recover. But for now, I just want you to notice if any of these reactions sounds familiar to you. And I can see, Vincent, thank you, you've already shared. You're getting ahead of me there, got shared in the chat, so thank you. That shock, yeah, especially when you were sure of a positive outcome. Absolutely, when you've put so much effort in, you think, this is definitely, I've nailed this one. And it can come up as a real shock. So that first stage, yeah, absolute shock, numbness, that moment of disbelief, emotional shutdown. It physically feels like a freeze response. Your mind kind of goes blank and your heart starts racing and you feel a bit foggy. Now, I feel like this. So I run workshops like I'm doing today. I'm running this webinar and we ask participants to fill out feedback forms, as we will do today. And in some of our forms, we'll ask them to rate the workshop between a scale of 1 to 5. And I always think, oh gosh, there's a bit of feedback coming. And I immediately start to feel a bit like, a bit nervous about opening the email, opening the feedback form to see what have they scored me. It's that thing of as if usually, it does land at a 4 or a 5. But even when it's a 4, I'm like, oh, why isn't it a 5? And then if it's a 3, I feel like it's it's catastrophe. I sometimes can't even go on to read what they've said about why it's a 3. Sometimes I'll just literally feel a bit, oh, I felt like it landed quite well, what went wrong? And sometimes I'll just run. So I'll just put it to one side, you'll freeze and not be able to look at it. So that's that kind of shock, that numbness. And then there's the shame and frustration, embarrassment, anger, that self-criticism, thoughts of, oh, I could have done that better. Oh, I know where I went wrong. It must have been that bit that I'd gone wrong at. Or I didn't quite explain that or articulate that quite that well. And it's where we're most likely to then overwork or withdraw or avoid. So like me with the feedback, I'll just sometimes just avoid even looking at it because it just feels too exposing. I don't want to know because I'm not ready, I'm not prepared. Then you might go into the stage 3 where it's defensiveness, denial, sometimes we protect ourselves by rationalizing or arguing internally. Have you been at that point where you're just rereading the feedback, mentally debating the reviewers? You're like, I've definitely done, yeah, I've absolutely, definitely done that more than once. I'm like, no, that's not what I meant. How have they got that? And it's that kind of disbelief, that kind of like, they've got that wrong, and that real defensiveness coming out. And your brain is going into that fight response. You're defending your competence in that moment. So if you found yourself doing that, that's what's happening. And then we can move into hopelessness and low mood, that repeated rejection. You've submitted that paper for the fourth or fifth time, and it can be really demoralizing. And you can hit that kind of phase of that low mood, that hopelessness, thinking, oh, what's the point? And it can be really tough. And this is where often people get quite stuck. And this is where that self-compassion really matters the most. And eventually, over time, when we begin to process, when we think, okay, right, it's probably time to really look at what this feedback is telling me. And okay, maybe I should share this with somebody and start talking through it, start to see what you can learn from it. And finally, you make that shift from that emotional impact, those emotional thinking, to more reflective thinking. And that's where perspective starts to return. You get growth and integration. And then we start to see that the rejection just becomes part of the story. It helps you redirect, refocus, or even support others through similar experiences. It doesn't stop hurting, it still hurts. You'll still look back at some of these experiences and think, oh yeah, that wasn't very nice. But you've moved on from it. And instead of carrying that level of shame, it just gives you that little bit of insight. So I'd just like you to take a moment about where you sit on this curve and where you feel that you might get stuck. And then think about times what actually helps you to move forward when you actually do move forward. Just reading a few bits from the chat. Yeah, how quickly you move through the curve depends on how the rejection was delivered, whether it's constructive or mean. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, unfortunately, the way that it's delivered can hit in different ways. And I think the way that we deliver feedback can be really constructive, and everybody receives feedback in different ways. So unless you have that conversation, for example, with your supervisor about what works for you in terms of feedback, do you like to hear the good stuff first, the positive praise, before then moving into some of the things that need to be worked on? Or do you want to just go, nope, just forget that bit, I just want to go straight to what I need to work on? Everybody's different in the way that they handle feedback, and unfortunately we can't control when reviews and how they might go about doing that, because they won't necessarily know you personally. So yeah, how we kind of then, how it hits us will be slightly different. Well, thank you for sharing. Sharing with colleagues is really helpful. Find similar stories. Yeah, and you're not alone. Absolutely. When I was working through this workshop, shared with one of my colleagues, and he said that when he was a postdoc, he got, I think it was 8 or 9 rejections for fellowship application before he finally got there. It's real, but sharing with others does help you kind of get away from that emotion and seeing it from a slightly different perspective and being able to work through those next steps. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Rana. So this chart here, it kind of pulls together some of the emotions that we come up with when we experience rejection. It's not meant to be exhaustive, and it's not a checklist at all, but it just gives you that vocabulary to describe what's happening internally. So you might notice some emotions cluster together. For example, things like shame or embarrassment might sit with things like self-blame or those imposter thoughts, or frustration can tip easily into anger or defensiveness. When we feel fear, we might feel hopeless, and that can also show up as overwhelm or apathy or just that low mood. And this language really matters, because actually, if there's one thing you take away from this webinar today, is that naming what we feel can actually help us separate ourselves from that emotion. So instead of thinking, I'm a failure, we begin to say, oh, I'm feeling disappointed right now. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I'm feeling a bit irritated or angry. And actually naming that emotion just takes that energy out of it. So it takes you that shift from being the emotion to actually noticing the emotion, and it really opens up that little bit of distance. So I encourage you to really try it, put it into practice. And that in that space, then you've got that space then for self-compassion. And that's where you can start reflecting and start to grow and things begin to happen. Okay, yeah. So there is that, it's that initial reaction, just reading from Nora, sharing in the chat, a weep first, then a look at why I failed, work on the corrections and look elsewhere. So that's the thing of, okay, just accepting that the emotion is real and that's okay to sit with that emotion. And then actually, okay, what are the next steps? Thank you for sharing that. So our internal voice, we do have an internal voice. This slide, just really kind of shows some of those common voices. So to make this a little bit more tangible, let's just imagine a scenario. You've just received an unexpectedly negative feedback on a draft of a paper that you actually felt quite proud of. So this might be from a supervisor. You think you've put loads of work into this. So immediately you're like, what? Hold on, that can't be right. You feel that shock initially. And then when we're in shock, when you feel like the work was quite strong. I know somebody mentioned in the chat that, when you feel like you're expecting a positive response and then it doesn't land, it can really hit you. And then that shame creeps in, the voice turns inwards, oh, I've let myself down, I'm so rubbish. And then we can start to question our ability and our worth, even though it's just one piece of feedback. It's amazing, isn't it, how one little thing can have such a huge impact. And then frustration sets in, what's the point? It never goes my way. You start just feeling, I can't be bothered, feeling a bit angry or defeated, especially when you've worked so hard and you just feel a little bit misunderstood, or they're not really getting my point, they're not seeing things from my perspective. Then you get defensive, whatever, they just don't get what I'm doing. It's a natural response. And mind puts that shield up to preserve confidence when something feels unfair or threatening. And then fear appears, it can start to spiral. What if this means I've failed completely? Start catastrophizing, thinking, oh gosh, nothing I write's ever going to look right. I've tried so hard on this. And just imagining what this feedback might mean for your future career and your credibility. And then that hopelessness. What's the point? I don't have the energy to try again. A string of rejections or tough feedback, it can feel really easy to disengage than to actually risk that disappointment again. And finally, we do get time for that reflection where we maybe do share with another colleague. You think, gosh, I'm not sure I want to go through that again, but I've moved on and start looking at the way that you've maybe responded to that particular rejection and what can you do to help make that process a little bit easier next time. So we start to look at the bigger picture. Maybe the feedback helped to improve the paper or taught us something about how we cope with criticism. So we might think, okay, so next time we do the paper, I'll do it this way rather than that way. That's the bit of advice that might help me move on. And we all move through these voices differently, sometimes in hours, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it might be a few minutes, or we might circle back, particularly when it's really pertinent. We might think, oh gosh, that voice is coming back. And it's not a sign of weakness. All of these things are perfectly natural. It's our brain's way of protecting ourselves from threat to preserve our sense of self. So later we will look at ways to respond to these voices with curiosity and compassion rather than letting them take control. So here's part of my own rejection timeline. And what I remember feeling most strongly at these points. Some of these emotions felt quite personal, like shame, embarrassment, frustration, and others were more protective, like defensiveness, rationalizing. You notice it's not neat, it's not linear. I've just reflected back and thought what stood out the most when I look back at some of these rejections. So when I put it together, I just chose that main emotion, even though sometimes it could be a mix of emotions. But it is rarely just that one feeling. And on your timeline, however you want to put it together, you might put a mixture of emotions. But for the simplicity and for this slide, it would look quite busy if I tried to put all of those emotions on there. The truth is, it is a mix, and it can shift hour by hour, minute by minute. But behind every one of these behind every success story, there sits this much longer story of rejection, learning, and emotion. And that's what really shapes our confidence far more than we actually realize. So I'm just going to move now on to give you that time to really kind of take a short pause and connect this to your own experiences. So I want you to revisit your timeline for a moment and just notice the emotions that stand out most for you. Which emotion most often follows rejection for you? Maybe it's shame, anger, fear, hopelessness. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which has got a list of all the emotions, if that's helpful for you, just to kind of pick out ones that kind of resonate with you. And I will also share the activity in the chat in a moment, and then I'll start the 5 minutes. I'll come back to some of the things in the chat as well in a moment. Okay, so this is what's shared in the workbook. If you're not working from the workbook, that's in the chat. And then here is obviously the list of emotions as well. So we'll come back at 9:56. Thank you. Okay, so as you come back, just take a breath. You don't need to share anything unless you want to. That reflection is purely for you. Thank you to Nora for highlighting that you do feel that disappointment, that frustration and anxiety, but that it does eventually turn into that determination, that acceptance and reflection. And that's what you're wanting to do as you're working through that cave, to get to that point where you can reflect and accept what's happened, accept that rejection and be able to move forward from it. But that's not without forgetting about that disappointment, and that anxiety and frustration is really real. And to be able to sit with that and understand that, and to be able to then reflect on it to move forward. So now we're going to move on from emotions to something even more tangible. So how rejection actually feels physically in the body. So we've talked about some of these emotions. Now we're going to look at the physical sensations. So rejection doesn't just live in our thoughts, it shows up in our bodies. And neuroscientists have shown that social rejection activates the same areas of the brain as physical pain. So when you feel that knot in your stomach, your heart racing, or your shoulders tightening, it's not you being oversensitive, it's your nervous system responding to that perceived threat. So just, have a look at this image. Where do you tend to feel rejection in your body? Happy for you to share that in the chat if you feel comfortable. Is it, in your chest? I always feel it in my chest, or that lump in my throat, or that heavy feeling. Or perhaps it's your hands clenching, fidgeting, shaking. Some people actually notice it in their voice, talking faster, going quiet. Or others might feel it in their stomach, just feel a little bit sick. It's that sinking or that frozen feeling. And actually becoming aware of these physical sensations is actually really powerful. Because often we don't necessarily notice them in the way, or recognize them in the way that we should. But it is really that first step in being able to regulate our response. And once we can recognize what's happening in the body, we can actually start to work with it to calm it through things like breathing or grounding exercises, or even movement. So when I open that in my inbox and I see that there's some feedback coming, using that example again, I might think, oh no, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to read that. So I might get up, I might go for a walk, I might just take 5 minutes just to go, okay, now I'm ready. And actually it can be something simple like that. It can just get you in the right headspace to feel a bit more grounded in terms of how you then might approach that bit of feedback, opening that email. Or you've seen that a grant proposal's just come back, or a paper, that, you just don't want to know, isn't it? But actually just taking a moment. And also, I think it's really important to recognize some of these physical sensations and see where they tend to hold tension and where that rejection really shows up for you. So when I look back So we've got the brain for me where I can't focus for a while and feeling restless. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vincent, for sharing. It's that you suddenly go blank and you just can't think straight and it's really struggling to focus. Yeah, that's a very, very real kind of feeling. It's amazing, isn't it? How the body can have such a reaction. So when I look back at one of my earliest rejections, when I had my paper rejected and eventually it was abandoned. So it was a paper, it was a bit of work that I'd done that I think it was from potentially from my work that I'd started off during my PhD, actually, which was quite a significant amount of time before that I then built upon. I thought, oh, let's try and get this published. And, I just felt when it came back and it was rejected, and then my supervisor said to me, oh, we're just going to leave it. And it was just abandoned. I just felt really disappointed. I felt quite frustrated. Just felt a bit hopeless. And in me, that initially I just felt really low, really disappointed. I felt like I couldn't think clearly and just felt hopeless and a little bit lump in my throat at the time. I felt like a bit upset that, oh, I've worked really hard on that piece of work and it's not going to go anywhere. And then eventually, I found myself just feeling a bit hopeless, and that often, came in waves. And eventually, I did move on from it. But when I look back, it was really clear that this wasn't just the emotional experience. I just didn't feel, just the emotional named like frustration, anxiety, hopelessness, but that it was physical as well. It really kind of impacted me in my mood and my energy. So social rejection really activates the same parts of the brain as that to register that physical pain, so that knot in your stomach, heaviness in your chest. It's not you being oversensitive, it's your emotional system, your nervous system responding to that perceived threat. So I want you again just to spend sort of a quick 3 minutes or so just to revisit your timeline and maybe pick an example, maybe one that felt particularly difficult or stayed with you. See if you can remember what in that moment what it felt like physically. If nothing specific comes to mind, it's probably quite hard to think back over some examples. What did you actually physically feel in that moment? But just maybe notice where the stress shows up for you. Where does that tension? Vincent shared that it was the brain for him. That's where he feels a lack of focus. So just have a look through your timeline again. I'm just going to give you 3 minutes just to work on that, and I will share this in the chat. Hold on a moment. We do have, I'm not going to share the picture of the body. We've got like an outline of the body in the workbook that you can actually identify or highlight the parts in the body that feel that it affects. Hold on, I'm just going to. Okay, and then I'm just going to share these physical sensations again so you can have a look through these, and it's always easier to pick out and think, oh, actually, what sits with me. So I'm going to give you until 5 past 10 to do that. Okay. So as we come back, just, want you to notice, what really stood out to you. And those physical sensations often give us a clue about what the next move will be, whether we fight, freeze, flight, or fawn. And we're going to take a look at that after the break. So we have got talking less. I thought you were telling me to talk less. Yeah, absolutely. That is something that, that physical sensation, you just withdraw into yourself and speak less. Thank you for sharing. So just to give you that time now and just for you to stretch your legs and just have a few moments yourself, we are going to take, we can actually move forwards, there we go, to our 10-minute break. And so we will be back at 10:15. Okay, so I'll see you back then. Hey, just like to welcome you all back. Hope you've had a chance to make a cup of tea, or if you or get a drink, or just stretch your legs. Just to take that moment, I've just popped my head outside and took a deep breath of fresh air, just to to have that grounding moment. Okay, so next we're going to move on to the bit more about the biological model. So our brain's number one job is to keep us safe. Thousands of years ago, that meant spotting real threats. And I'm using the classic example like seeing a tiger in the wild. The moment that danger appeared, our brain triggers a cascade of physical reactions: faster heartbeat, tight chest, foggy thinking, the body preparing to basically survive. At least in the UK, our only possible interaction with a tiger would probably be in a zoo. And if we happen to find ourselves in a scene from Harry Potter, for example, where magically the glass separating you and the tiger suddenly disappears, then that threat might actually suddenly feel a little bit more real. And you would immediately feel those physical reactions like your heart beating, your chest tightening, your freeze off flight response kicking in. Your brain is predicting danger and it's telling your body there's real danger nearby and you need to stay safe and alert. And our brain doesn't distinguish between that physical danger and social threats like criticism, uncertainty, or rejections, or moments that threaten our sense of belonging, our competence, and can trigger the same process as physical pain. So, in the same way, when we submit a paper and we feel that rejection, it triggers the same part of the brain, and we feel those physical reactions again: wanting to run away, the heart beating fast, not being able to think clearly. So when your paper, gets rejected, the feedback doesn't really land very well, it still sends the same signals to your brain to stay safe. your fast heartbeat, it's there to really protect you. And over time, the brain even learns from these moments. So when you think about submitting a paper again, or if you think about going to that zoo again, you might think again and go, absolutely not. My brain is telling me to stay safe and to stay clear. I don't want any more disappearing glasses and tigers potentially threatening me. So once again, even when you think about submitting a paper, or you think about that, what that feedback might look like behind that, opening that email, you're already feeling those physical sensations. And they're there to stop you from feeling hurt again, essentially. So when we face rejection, our brain doesn't distinguish between that tiger in the jungle and reviewer number 2. And I know reviewer number 2 can probably feel like a fierce tiger sometimes. It detects that threat, uncertainty, and that loss of control, and it does what it's designed to do, to protect us. And that protection shows up in 4 instinctive survival responses: the freeze, so shutting down or feeling stuck; flight, avoiding, distracting, or pulling away; the fight, to push harder, proving yourself, trying to regain control; and the fawn, pleasing others to restore that safety and belonging. They're all just different ways of coping with emotional threat, and our brain is saying, just stay safe, don't get hurt again. And you might recognize some of these in yourself. In one or 2 of these, you might think, oh, how do I do all of them? Or there might be things that stand out more to you than others in particular situations. I'm happy for you to share that in the chat. We look a little bit more closely at what these things might actually mean. So in terms of fight, freeze and fight, flight, my goodness, they're quite difficult to get the right one. These patterns can feel protective in that moment, but over time they can work against us, particularly when we're wanting to learn and grow. So if you tend to freeze, that might look like procrastination, overthinking, isolating yourself. You might find you can't decide what to do next, or you slip into that kind of perfectionism, writing, rewriting, and rewriting again until you actually feel like it's perfect enough to submit. And there's that real tendency, and I've definitely been in that space when I've felt I've just got to keep going and get this perfect. I can't let anybody see it until it's perfect. Good enough is not good enough, and it's that mentality, that kind of free response of not being able to move forward with it. Thank you, Vincent, for sharing. That freeze response feels quite real to you as well. And then it might be that flight response. It can look like distraction, busyness, jumping straight to something else. That thing of, oh, I'm just going to push that to one side and move on with something else. Like that running from distraction, from that rejection, and minimizing the rejection as well. And that kind of emotional blunting. And we also have then the fight and fawn. So for others, the instinct might be to fight, to push harder, to overwork, to rewrite or replay what happens in your head, but trying to kind of gain control and prove yourself again, which can be incredibly draining, just to throw yourself back in there, just to kind of fight back against it, watching others, what they're doing. And then there's fawn, where the instinct is to keep the peace and say yes, or seek reassurance. It's about restoring that belonging and safety through people pleasing or avoiding conflict. And none of these are wrong. All of these are adaptive, protective responses, and it gives us that kind of short-term relief. But then it can end up with a long-term cost, because it's kind of keeping us in that protection mode rather than moving us into the learning mode. So we've looked at how rejection shows up emotionally and physically, and how our brain responds to protect us through those instinctive fight, flight, and freeze or fawn reactions. And I want you to revisit your timeline and think about what usually happens next. So when things go wrong, what is your most common behavioural response? You've had the emotion and the physical reaction. What happens next for you? So I'd just like you to spend sort of 3 minutes just to consider this. Is it to freeze, to fight, to push harder, to flight, or to fawn? And I will share the activity again in the chat. Yeah, we are fawn. Okay, and I'm just going to move on to the next slide so that you can see all of the different responses and pick out anything that might resonate with you. These are not limited as well, if there's anything else that jumps out. Okay, so we'll come back at 10:25. Okay, no, thank you. I can see Nora sharing in the chat there, definitely on the fight mode, fight and flight. So that kind of overworking, minimizing the rejection, and straight into that overworking, re-editing, straight mentally replaying things. Now, does any of these specific behaviors, do you recognize those in you? You know, feel free to share in the chat if anything really kind of jumps out to you. Even if it's just a word, if it's the fight or the flight, or if it's things like overworking, what really kind of jumps out? What's that kind of natural response for you? Freeze and flight. Yeah, that procrastination, overthinking. Yeah, that procrastination and perfectionism. Yeah, spend a lot of time trying to get that thing absolutely perfect, and it's almost stopping yourself from moving forward. Freeze and flight. Lots of overthinking and self-isolation. Yeah, these are all real. Brilliant. Thank you for sharing in the chat. It's good to see, you know, how others are feeling and that we're not alone in this. You know, we are all having these natural responses when it comes to rejection, how it shows up for us and what behaviors that we then display. And it's really good to kind of get an idea of just reflecting on that for a moment. Actually, what does that look like for me? And okay, is that my natural behavior? How long do I stay in that behavior before I can then move on from that? So thank you for sharing there. Okay, so before we move on to the final part of the workshop, we'll look at some tools and resources. I'd just like to highlight this model. You might have come across it before. It's by Joan Rosenberg, the Rosenberg Reset, and it's kind of a useful practice in those initial moments when you feel that wave of physical sensations and emotions. And it describes that the most that the most emotional waves last only about 90 seconds if we allow ourselves to feel them without resisting. So the first thing is to kind of notice, to pause and acknowledge, to kind of notice that emotion without judgment, and know that it will peak and pass in 90 seconds. To breathe and to stay present, to really focus in on that physical sensation, where you're feeling it, if it's the chest, it's the fluttering, if it's the feeling, and to try and stay connected with that feeling without really resisting it. And then, as I've said before, it can be really simple but powerful, one that can be practiced at any time, not just in the moments of rejection, but just to kind of really name that emotion. And it has a really calming effect and makes you emotionally aware. So just to say, I feel embarrassed at this moment in time, and it actually just separates you out from that emotion. And then the release and the resistance, just to let go of that urge to suppress and to quickly distract or overanalyze the emotion. Just to, just to sit with it, name it. I feel frustrated, I feel anxious, and can really activate the part of the brain that helps to calm the emotional response as well. So it's something really small, but it can be a quick win. So as I've said before, I do challenge you to try that next time you feel that wave of emotion. Okay. So we've looked at how rejection can trigger strong emotional and physical responses, and how our brain moves into protection through the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And this curve brings us back to the idea that rejection isn't just a single moment, that it's a process. And most of us move through the stages like shock, frustration, defensiveness, and low mood before we can actually begin to reflect. And that's perfectly natural. And it's important. It's an important part of how we respond to things. But then it's important to notice that growth doesn't come instead of these emotions, that these emotions need to happen. And it's really recognizing where that turning point into reflection and growth is happening, and to try and start processing the rejection and be able to move forward. So it might be looking back with curiosity rather than with judgment. What did this experience show me about what matters to me, on what I might do differently next time? So having that kind of moment to go, okay, it didn't land quite right. What can I learn from this experience? And sometimes, we'll get to do a little bit of reflection and something will trigger us and we'll end up right back in frustration and shame. And that's completely normal. It's those sort of small steps. It's not to avoid this kind of curve, but it's to recognize that we can find little steps forward, just one thing at a time. And some things might be more difficult to move to that kind of growth phase than others. Some things it might be, easier to work on small things where you feel that rejection and think, okay, so how can I push myself along this curve into reflection and growth? And then use those same kind of methods to then work on the bigger challenges. I'm going to put that on my wall. Fantastic. So I bring back my CV development. So this is the same timeline you saw earlier, at least in the orange at the bottom. And what I've added on here is what happened after each rejection. So when I look back now, I can see that each setback shaped what came next, even if I couldn't actually see it at the time. So getting my degree through clearing actually led to a year in industry in my third year of my degree, and that really built my confidence. The paper that I abandoned eventually taught me that actually how to refine my writing and my experimental approach, and that actually just accept that not all experiments lead to publication, that some roads just simply don't lead anywhere, and that's okay. The grant rejections helped me to sharpen my ideas, and in the end, one of them was funded. So actually having those reviewer comments and being able to reflect on them and work through them with my supervisor helped us then reframe and condense. I think we had far too much stuff in there, and focus in on really what the outcome of what we were looking for. And we eventually had some grant funding. That was my most recent grant. And then, what's interesting is that the positives didn't actually come instead of the rejection. They came because of what I'd learned through it. So those 8 rejections on that one paper, eventually I got a joint first author on that paper. I didn't start off as a joint first author, I was a second author, but I spent so much work reviewing and changing the paper and adapting and doing a few more experiments to make the paper what it was. And it ended up in probably the best tome for it. So that was a real growth in that phase where, it was frustrating. And I was like, why did we aim so high? Following the primary supervisor's lead. And I learned a lot through that process. And reflection didn't erase all the discomfort, it gave those moments meaning and helped me find sort of that direction, perspective, and growth. And as Vincent's put in the chat, absolutely, rejection sometimes is a signal to something big or a better direction. Absolutely. And, I'll just bring out an example when I was looking for a change in career. So I was a postdoc for a long time, and I wanted to move into professional services to support researchers. And I went through several rounds of different job applications, things not really, I think a few places that probably weren't the right thing for me. And actually, I'm quite glad that I didn't land a role in a different department. And eventually it led to this role. And I absolutely love what I do now. And I've really found my place. So if I'd have got one of the other roles, it wouldn't have been absolutely that right. So really, it does signal to something better and something that feels more aligned. And it's about reframing some of that rejection. It's not pretending it didn't hurt. Yes, that interview rejection. My gosh, I got through to the third round of the interviews, and I put so much effort into it. It's the first one I'd had for a long time. And I think obviously that first time after you've been out of that space of job hunting for quite a while, it really hurt. I got really upset and I got angry and I got defensive, and all of the emotions came out. But I'm glad, because I just realised that would not work for me. It wasn't the right role. So it did work out better in the end, and being able to look back and go, actually, yeah, it did hurt at the time, but look where I am now. Look what came next. So, at the time I didn't recognise it, but my reaction here in that first instance where I had that late university entry, I didn't do well in my exams. I felt that shame and embarrassment. Previously I'd always done really well in my exams, so I felt that I was letting my family down, and my behaviour just went into overworking. I was seeking approval. I was gone into perfectionist mode. And I went into that kind of fight mode, work harder, prove that I belonged. I spent the first year of my university actually overworking, trying to make up for starting late, determined to, get high enough grades to secure a year in industry. And in some ways that drive did motivate me, but it also was mixed in with that perfectionism and overworking and a constant need for validation that I was doing good enough. And looking back, a lot of that was coming from me wanting to prove myself, and even to appease my family, even though they weren't putting any pressure on me to do that. It was something that I'd really kind of internalized. But I felt all of those emotions. And, when I look back, I see how it kind of shaped how my response to failure. So my natural response was to go into that perfectionism and overworking. And then gradually it's taken time for me to actually step back and think, you know what, that's good enough. I don't need to keep working on this and working on this. And that's good enough for what the need is, and then I'll work on the next steps as we go through. And this was probably one of those first academic failures for me, and it really taught me about that it is uncomfortable, and it was uncomfortable talking about it, but then talking about it does help, and actually seeing what came next, and that you can work with these failures. They happen to everybody. So, as you look on your own timeline, consider this. What did you do after rejection? Did you throw yourself into work, avoid it, shut down, or seek reassurance from others? And all of these responses are absolutely normal. They're our way of protecting ourselves, but noticing what next is really what helps us to grow and reflect. And again, here's another example. Fast forward to 2024. So last year, I went for a professional recognition award, and I was actually developing a support program to help others with their applications for the award that I just put in for. Even with everything I knew about mindset, reflection, my first reaction was still emotional when I got rejected or when I got referred for the award, I felt so embarrassed. I felt shamed. And that familiar voice of imposter syndrome crept in and it said, how can I be showing others what to do when I've failed at this myself? And my instinct was to run. I just didn't want to be there, move on quickly. I just, I just didn't want to sit, I just sat with that discomfort. But this time, rather than sitting with that shame and that embarrassment, I thought I need to act on this. What can I do? And I thought, no, I'm going to move on from this. And I caught myself in that. And I thought, no, this is an opportunity for me to use all the tools I've been talking about to lean into the feedback rather than to avoid it. So I thought, right, let's sit, look through the feedback. What can I do? And I wasn't 100% happy with what I'd submitted. And I thought, right, I can improve this. This is an opportunity. So I embraced the feedback, stepped out of my comfort zone and reworked on that application. And then the process didn't just help me get the award. The next time round, it actually helped me shift the story from, that story in my head that I'm a failure to actually, no, I'm learning from this. And actually, I was so much happier with what my submission was in the end. And I feel much proud of the award that I was recognised for. And perhaps more importantly, it gave me that confidence to support others through the same process, to use my experience to show that rejection doesn't define us. How we respond to it does. So I'm really open about, okay, I'm talking you through on how to maybe support you in this application process. This is a journey I went through myself and I was referred initially, but these are the things I learned from it. And, really kind of stepping outside of my comfort zone and just being able to use the experience to empower others. I just found that incredibly invaluable in helping me to kind of reflect and grow. Just reading something in the chat from Neelam. Instaclip yesterday, user called, she was saying that highly intelligent people don't tie their identity to being right. They owe up to changing their minds. They treat being wrong like data. They take it in, reflect, and are willing to change. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Neil. Absolutely. Let's not absorb these failures. So you've seen how I've reframed my timeline. So now it's your turn to reflect on your journey. Please again, look at your timeline and look at one or two moments of rejection or setbacks. What actually happened after those moments? What changed in your work, your mindset, your choices, relationships? What happened next? You might notice sort of subtle growths or new boundaries. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to kind of really think about what happened next in one or two or however many you want to work on. Okay, let's come back into the room. Just reading what Nora's put into the chat, and that's some great tips there. To reach out to previously awarded fellowship applicants, to request winning documents and to compare with your own. That's some great initiative there. And you never know, don't you, unless you try, unless you reach out to people. And people are more than often happy to help. So I'm glad that was a really positive response for you, and to hear that you got the fellowship. That's fantastic. You had a choice of two. So doing these things, that's a great example. Thank you, Nora, for sharing. So when we think about reflection and growth, what really shapes us is how we respond to rejection is our mindset. If we have a fixed mindset, the results define me, I'm not good at this, the focus becomes proving yourself, avoiding failure, seeking approval and staying safe. Whereas the growth mindset, on the other hand, what can this teach me, rather than what does this say about me? And it doesn't happen instantly. It's not about pretending rejection doesn't hurt. It's about approaching those moments with curiosity and compassion instead of that judgment. So as you think about your reflection so far, notice where your mindset tends to sit. It might sit in different places depending on what the rejection is. When something doesn't go to a plan, do you find yourself withdrawing or protecting or minimizing the risk? Or do you lean in and explore what you could do differently next time, even if it feels uncomfortable at first? just take a moment just to think about your most recent setback. Where would you place yourself on this slide at the time? Where would it be? And where would you like it to be? So, in a recent experience, I might have maybe shied away from unfamiliar things. I went for a trustee role, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to go for it. I was in competition with the dean of the doctoral college, and I didn't get it. But I'd stepped outside of my comfort zone. I thought, I'm just going to try. I don't know until I try, and I put myself in that space. And actually, the dean of the doctoral college did get the trustee place, but he said, "Oh, it's third time lucky for me. I'd been pushed back two other times before that time, so that made me feel a bit more comfortable." And actually, I felt that kind of sense of relief. I thought, oh, I wasn't quite ready for it anyway, but I was willing to push myself, into that kind of uncomfortable zone. So let's try and bring everything together now. So we've looked at how we manage emotions, how our mindset shapes our responses, and how reflection helps us find meaning in rejection. So now we're moving on from awareness to action. So here's a rejection recovery plan. It's a simple framework to help you move from reaction to that initial emotional hit, to reflection, and then to a more considered response. So in this short term, it's about pausing, breathing, using things like the Rosenberg reset, acknowledging what's happened and the rejection, acknowledge what happened without judgment or any kind of self-blame, and then seeking that feedback. And I always find that's such a vital part in the process and the recovery. It's just talking to others, sharing with somebody you feel comfortable with to share. You might have that go-to colleague that you think, oh, actually, they'll be good to talk to. They'll be good for me to bounce ideas off. And then identifying any immediate actions. Is there anyone else that might have been impacted by the rejection? Is it a collaboration that you've got? And just to maybe communicate with effective parties, maybe adjust any grant deadlines. If you were waiting for a paper that you needed data from to go into a grant, then it's all of these things, identifying those immediate actions that you might need to take. And then in terms of a longer term response, then the shift kind of focus to learning and planning, so analysing what happened, and setting realistic goals and developing sort of contingency plans and documenting what you've learned. So this version of the rejection recovery plan draws everything together we've explored, so emotional awareness, mindset, and that adaptability. So start really by analysing the experience, not just the outcome. Ask yourself what emotions, what beliefs and behaviours might have actually shaped it. So really looking into what those behaviours are. And then define clear reflective goals that support your growth rather than looking for perfection. And prepare for challenges. So anticipate, think ahead, but like Nora's done with seeking out, resources from other people to help support her to move forward. What are your backup plans? What things have you got in place? And finally, document what you've learned. So, a personal or team journal, or what I tend to do after workshops, I'll do a quick mind download, and literally I'll just write down everything that's in my head about the workshop, how it's gone. I'll do that after this today. I'll sit just for 5-10 minutes, just a brain dump, and then I'll just leave it. I'll come back to it at another point, but just to get it all out in that moment. It can be really something I've found that's really helpful for me to do anyway. Or a journal, if you're used to writing in something every day, I'm a bit more sporadic in the way that I do things. But ultimately, this stage is about turning rejection into a resource, something that strengthens your future decision rather than holds you back. Now, this is another exercise that can be really useful. So once the emotion kind of settles and you're looking at the next perspective, this model, you might have come across it. It's called zones of control. And here I've used grant applications as a model to really recognise where to focus our energy after a setback. We all go into that, there wasn't much funding there, so the competition was high, lots of other applications. We don't know who's reviewing applications, the focus and the priorities of the funder and success rates. And this is where we might naturally go to spend a lot of time. In fact, that's completely outside of our control. We cannot control any of these. But what can we control? And that all sits in that zone of control. I suppose the feelings linked with the zone of concern is things like frustration and helplessness. And, it lends more to us if we look into those zones of influence and zones of control, thinking about how we prepare, who we collaborate with, how we seek feedback, and how we manage our time and response. So within that zone of control, your time, you have that choice of who you collaborate with, and you have that opportunity to obtain peer review, ask other people to review papers, or to get that fresh look on, what might you be missing, and are you targeting the right sort of journals and these kinds of things when it comes to publishing. Then the zones of influence, you can influence the type of research that you pursue, the institutional support and buy-in. You can influence letters of support and how reviewers interpret your application as well. So it's really thinking about, I still have influence here, and it's that some of the most powerful kind of anecdotes when it comes to rejection. Not to really focus in on the things that you can control, but what can you do? What can you influence? Okay, so next up, we're just going to spend sort of 5 minutes now just doing, drafting your recovery plan. So we explored emotion, mindset, and perspective. So I want to bring it all together. So you have about 5 minutes now. I think we're getting a bit shorter on time. I was doing right with time to start with, but it's slipped away from me a little bit. So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to work through this, and we'll come back to it. So I'll just share the chat. We'll come back at 57. Oh, yeah, no, we'll do 57, give you 4 minutes. If you want to spend longer on this afterwards, then you can do that. Okay. I hope you've had a little bit of an opportunity to really think about what steps that you can take to, draft your own recovery plan. I just want to share something with you quickly. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there was an example of a lab in America who have a day where they celebrate all of the rejections, all the failures, all of the grants that haven't been accepted or been rejected, all the negative things, and they just have a celebration about it. And I thought that was a really nice way to reframe and to kind of normalize those feelings of rejection. So please do kind of take that time to to speak with your colleagues, create a day where you go, actually, yeah, this didn't work. It's fine. Let's celebrate together. So I just wanted to share that little anecdote with you. Okay, so yeah, so collaborate with colleagues that are more knowledgeable than myself. That's a great way to take that step forward, learn from others and what they've done to kind of take those next steps. Thank you, Grace, for sharing. So let's just come back together in this last couple of minutes. You've spent some time reflecting on your own experiences, hopefully starting to shape that kind of personal recovery plan. Which brings us back to what we set out today. At the start of the session, the aims are threefold: to recognise the rejection comes from many places, not just papers, grant rejections, but those small everyday moments that can really erode your confidence. Second, to reflect on how we explore and manage the emotional impact, recognising how we respond to things really matters as much as what happens. And third, to begin creating a personal plan to maintain motivation and resilience. So that reflection you just did is just the start of the process, but I hope it's a small but powerful step to a more compassionate and sustainable way of working for you. Rejection will always be a part of academic life, but it doesn't have to define us. And the more we talk about it and the more we learn and work through it together, then the more we'll be able to move into those kind of be more emotionally aware and be more adaptable. So I just want to say thank you today for bringing such honesty and openness to the session today. I really appreciate. I know it's quite a difficult topic to be able to be open and vulnerable about, but I do appreciate that. So I hope to leave with a little bit lighter, and hopefully you've got a few tools there that you can look into and work with. And finally, it just leads me on to say we've got our final session from our team on research culture. What is it, and why does it matter? And that's from my colleagues Marjorie Bossonot. And yeah, you're in for a real treat there. She's got some real insights into what research culture is all about. So that just leaves me to thank everybody today for coming and for your attention. I really appreciate your time. So thank you. Thank you.